A quiet forest highway. A red Ferrari. A black man pulled over for nothing more than driving something expensive. Officer Dale Pruett searched that car, damaged it, and put the driver on his knees in the gravel, convinced he had caught something big. What he didn't know was that the man in those handcuffs wasn't just calm. He was someone the federal government had buried so deep in a classified database that even the system flinched before showing his name. And that Ferrari wasn't just a car. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The highway stretched long and empty through the trees, the kind of road that made you feel like the rest of the world had been switched off. It was late afternoon on a Thursday, and the light falling through the pine canopy turned everything a deep amber gold. No traffic for miles in either direction, just the hum of wind and the rustle of leaves somewhere up above. The red Ferrari sat on the shoulder like something that had landed from another world. It was a 296 GTB, low, sharp, the color of a lit match. Every inch of it deliberate, every curve engineered to make other cars look like they were standing still. It gleamed even in the patchy forest light, and the two officers who had pulled it over stood near their cruiser, watching it the way men watch things they don't fully understand. Officer Dale Pruett was the one who'd made the call to pull the car over. He was 43, broad in the shoulder, with a sunburned neck and the kind of jaw that stayed tight even when he was relaxed. 14 years on the force, he had a way of leaning into confrontations that his supervisors had noted in his file twice and let slide 3 more times. He stood by the passenger door of the cruiser with his thumbs hooked into his belt and watched the Ferrari and said nothing. His partner, Officer Kevin Marsh, was 29. He'd been on the force for 3 years and still got a hollow feeling in his chest when things moved too fast. He was standing a few feet to the left of Dale, hands loose at his sides, eyes moving between the car and the tree line. "Registration came back clean," Kevin said. "Registration being clean doesn't tell you everything," Dale said. "Came back with 0 flags." "I said it doesn't tell you everything, Marsh." A small cluster of cars had slowed at the edge of the scene, 3, maybe 4 vehicles, and some pulling partway onto the shoulder, some just creeping past in the lane. Phones appeared in windows. This stretch of highway wasn't exactly remote. There was a gas station a quarter-mile back, and the drivers who'd been sitting at the pumps had drifted closer out of something between curiosity and the specific electric feeling people get when they sense something is about to go wrong. The driver's door of the Ferrari opened. The man who stepped out was around 32, 33. He wore dark slacks and a well-fitted charcoal shirt. No jewelry, no visible affectation. He moved with the kind of ease that doesn't perform itself. He wasn't trying to look calm, he simply was. He stepped around the car door and stood with his hands loose and visible, and he looked at Dale Pruett with steady, dark eyes that held no particular expression. "License and registration," Dale said. The man reached slowly into his back pocket, produced a wallet, and handed over both without a word. Dale took them and looked them over. His face didn't change. He handed the license to Kevin, who walked it back to the cruiser. "This your car?" Dale asked. "Yes," the man said. "You always drive this kind of car?" There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long on Dale's end. The man said nothing. "Where are you coming from?" "Business," the man said. "Business where?" "North of here." Dale tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's decided he already doesn't like the answer before it finishes. He looked at the Ferrari again, really looked at it, and something shifted behind his eyes. He came off the cruiser and walked around the front of the car, slowly, deliberate, like he was doing math in his head. "Car like this," Dale said, "that's $200,000 if it's a cent." The man didn't respond. "You know what I see a lot of on this stretch?" Dale said. "On this particular highway, between these two particular exits?" Still nothing. "Product," Dale said. "Expensive, moving fast, trying not to get noticed." He stopped by the driver's side rear quarter panel and looked at the man directly. "Car this clean, no luggage visible, coming from north on a Thursday. That tells a story." "Does it?" the man said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to need to take a look inside the vehicle. Do you have a warrant?" The question landed flat and calm, no edge to it, nothing provocative in the delivery. 4 words. Dale's jaw tightened. "I don't need a warrant if there's probable cause," Dale said. "What's the probable cause?" "The nature of the vehicle, the nature of the route." "The nature of the vehicle," the man repeated, letting that settle in the air for a moment. Kevin had come back from the cruiser with the license. He handed it to Dale quietly and stepped back. His eyes moved to the people on the shoulder, to the phones pointed at them, and then back to his partner. "Dale," he said, his voice low. Dale wasn't listening. He was looking at the man with something that had curdled past irritation into something more personal. "You think because you're driving $100,000 car, I'm supposed to just wave you through," Dale said. "I haven't said anything like that." "Open the vehicle." "Not without a warrant," the man said. He's still quiet, still level. What happened next was fast enough that Kevin almost thought he imagined it. Dale stepped forward and reached past the man's shoulder to grab the door handle, and in doing so, his elbow caught the edge of the side mirror mount. It was part accident, part something else. The impact cracked the carbon fiber housing and sent a shard of it skittering across the pavement. The mirror hung at a broken angle, no longer aligned with anything. The crowd on the shoulder went quiet for a half-second, and then the murmuring started. Kevin said, "Dale." "Probable cause," Dale said, pulling the door open. "I'm conducting a search." The man stood there and watched his car be opened. He didn't move forward. He didn't raise his voice. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched. And his expression was difficult to read. Not angry, not frightened. It was the look of a man who is watching a very specific thing happen and cataloging all of it, every detail, every second. "You're making a mistake you can't undo," he said. Dale was already leaning into the car's interior, moving things around, checking under the seats, pulling open the small console compartment. He checked the back shelf. He pressed his hand along the side panels. He found nothing. He came back out and checked the small front compartment at the front of the car. He opened it, looked inside for a long moment. Nothing. The crowd had grown. At least 7 or 8 people now, a couple of them openly recording. Phones raised. Kevin stood with his hands on his hips and looked at the ground. "There's nothing in there," Kevin said quietly. "Run the plates again," Dale said. "I already ran them. They're clean." "Then run them again." Dale came back to stand in front of the man, and something in his posture had changed. Not softened, but shifted, the way a man shifts when he knows he's been walking in the wrong direction, but refuses to turn around. "You're going to need to come with us," Dale said. "On what grounds?" "Obstructing a lawful search." "I complied with every request that was lawfully made," the man said. "I asked if you had a warrant. That's not obstruction." "You can make that case at the station," Dale said, and he reached for his handcuffs. Kevin stepped forward. "Dale, I really don't think—" "Marsh," Dale said sharply, and that one word stopped Kevin cold. The man didn't resist. He let Dale direct him to his knees on the gravel shoulder without a word, or without a flinch. He lowered himself down and put his hands behind his back and let the cuffs be applied, and the whole time he looked straight ahead at the tree line like he was somewhere else entirely. As he went down, his jacket shifted slightly, just briefly, and his hand moved almost imperceptibly to something inside the jacket before the cuffs locked in place. Whatever it was, it stayed out of sight. Nobody seemed to catch it. Kevin caught it. He wasn't sure what he'd seen. He filed it away. The crowd on the shoulder had gone from murmuring to fully vocal now. Somebody said something loud enough to carry. Dale told them to move along. Kevin opened the rear door of the cruiser and placed his hand carefully on the man's head as he got in. The one part of the procedure he made sure to do right. Inside the vehicle, while with the partition between them, Dale drove and Kevin sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window and said nothing for a long time. From the back seat, the man said nothing either. Dale kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting something. Anger, tears, demands, the usual. He got none of it. The man sat with his cuffed hands behind him and looked out the side window at the trees going past, and the absence of any reaction seemed to bother Dale more than a reaction would have. "You got nothing to say?" Dale said. No answer. "Not going to call your lawyer? Not going to tell me how much the car is worth?" The man's eyes moved to the rearview mirror and held Dale's gaze there for exactly 3 seconds, and then he looked back out the window. Dale turned the radio up. The Harlow County Sheriff's Station was a flat building on the edge of a commercial strip. Tan brick, fluorescent inside, the smell of burnt coffee going back years. The parking lot had 3 cruisers and a deputy's truck and an old evidence van that nobody used much anymore. They brought the man in through the side entrance. The duty desk officer, a woman named Carol, looked up as they came through and then looked back down at her screen. Her face stayed neutral, but her eyes went to the man briefly and then to Dale, and she said nothing. They put him in the processing room and started the intake. He gave his name when asked. He answered every basic processing question with a word or two. He didn't volunteer anything. He didn't ask for anything except water, which Kevin brought him without telling Dale. The other officers on shift came past the processing room door with varying degrees of casualness. A couple of them lingered. Nobody said anything directly, but the energy in the room had the specific quality that happens when a group of people are trying to look like they're not watching something. Dale moved through the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd done this so many times it had become automatic. Charges, obstruction, resisting search. He wrote it up cleanly. Carol came to the doorway of the processing room. She had a look on her face that wasn't quite right. "Dale," she said, "I'm in the middle of something." "I know, when I ran his ID in the system, there was... I'll check it later." "It didn't come back the way it usually does," she said. "There's a classification tag attached to..." "Carol," Dale said, and he looked up at her for the first time. His voice had a current running under it. "I'll look at it later." She held his gaze for 2 seconds, then looked at the man in the chair. Then she left. Kevin was standing near the door. He had watched that whole exchange without moving, and now he looked at the man in the chair who had been watching the exchange too. The man's eyes moved to Kevin and held there briefly, not with urgency, not with pleading, just taking note. "All right," Dale said, sliding the paperwork across the table. "Sign here." "I'd like to speak with a supervisor," the man said. "You can request that after processing." "I'd like to request it now." "Sign the paper." The man looked at the paper, then he looked at Dale. He signed it, and as he set the pen down, he looked at neither of them and said, "He's in a voice so quiet it almost didn't carry. You should have checked who you were arresting before you destroyed federal property." Dale looked up. Kevin went very still. The man said nothing else. They put him in holding at 9:47 in the evening. It was a standard cell, concrete bench, flat light, a door with a narrow vertical window. The kind of room designed to feel like time had stopped. Most people brought here couldn't sit still. They paced, or they argued with officers, or they made calls the moment they were allowed to. This man sat on the bench with his back against the wall and his forearms resting on his knees, and he waited. Down the corridor, Dale was in the break room telling the story to two other officers, Renfrew and a guy called Shupe, and his voice had the elevated energy of a man who believed he'd done something significant. Car like that, on that road, on a Thursday afternoon, no explanation for where he's been. That's not a coincidence, Dale was saying. I've been working that highway for 4 years. I know what moves on it. Search came back empty? Renfrew said. Nothing found in this search doesn't mean nothing's there. Could have already been transferred. The car itself is part of it. You use something that expensive. You're trying to signal clean, trying to pass. Renfrew said. I've seen it before, Dale said. Down the hall, Kevin Marsh sat at his desk and did not go to the break room. He had his computer open and he was staring at it. But he hadn't typed anything in several minutes. The intake report was on the screen. He read the man's name again. He read it a third time. There was nothing on the surface of the name that told him anything. It wasn't flagged in any database he could easily access. But Carol's face kept coming back to him, the way she'd started to say something and stopped, and the way Dale had cut her off before she could finish. Kevin had worked with Dale for 2 years, and he knew the difference between Dale being impatient and Dale not wanting something heard. That had been the second one. He typed a query into the department's shared record system, standard name search, cross-referenced with the vehicle registration. The result came back partial. Most of the file was visible. Address, date of birth, no priors, no warrants. But at the bottom of the record, where the standard disposition fields would normally appear, there was a line that read, Access restricted. Classification level, federal. Kevin read it twice. Then he closed the tab, looked around the room, and opened it again. The same line. The same restriction. He sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. In the break room, Dale was laughing about something. The sound carried down the corridor. The interrogation room at Harlow County was a rectangle with a table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs on each side. The fluorescent tube overhead had a faint flicker that happened every 40 seconds or so. Not enough to be a problem, just enough to notice. Dale conducted the questioning himself. He brought a folder, even though there was almost nothing in it yet. Because folders made people feel like you had more than you did. He sat down across from the man and opened the folder and looked at the empty page inside it for a moment, and then looked up. Let's start with where you were coming from, Dale said. I've answered that. Answer it again. I was traveling on a public highway within the posted speed limit, the man said. I gave you my license and registration when requested. You searched my vehicle without a warrant and found nothing. I'd like to know what I'm being charged with. Obstruction. I asked if you had a warrant. That's a legal question, not obstruction. You made the search difficult. I asked one question. Dale shifted in his chair. He pulled out the page from the folder, which turned out to be the intake form, and set it on the table between them. You refused to cooperate? Can you point to the moment I refused a lawful request? The man said. The question was not heated. It was the kind of question someone asks when they already know the answer and are simply establishing the record. Dale didn't answer it. What do you do for work? Dale said instead. I'm not going to answer that. Why not? Because I'm not obligated to. You're not making this easier on yourself. I'm not trying to make it easier or harder, the man said. I'm exercising my rights. Dale leaned forward slightly. You know what I've learned about people who know their rights that well? What? They've needed them before. The man looked at him steadily. Or they read. There was a long beat. Dale's mouth tightened. The man looked around the room, not nervously, not searching for anything, just looking. He took in the door, the camera mounted high in the corner, the gap at the bottom of the door, the second chair on Dale's side that was empty. He looked at the water cup on the table in front of him. He looked at the clock on the wall. He looked at everything the way someone looks at a place they're going to have to describe from memory later. Kevin was watching through the narrow window in the door. He'd been there for 4 minutes. He wasn't sure Dale knew he was there. The man started asking questions. "How long has this department had jurisdiction over that stretch of highway?" he said. Dale blinked. "What?" "The stretch of Route 9 between exits 14 and 17. Federal land borders that corridor." "What's your department's standing agreement with the county sheriff's office regarding stops in that zone?" "That's not relevant." "It might be," the man said. "What's the standard procedure for flagging a vehicle in that zone without a warrant? Who authorizes that?" "I'm asking the questions here," Dale said, and his voice had a new quality to it, tightened, not quite confident. "You asked what I do," the man said. "Let's just say I find answers to questions." Dale stood up. "We're done for tonight." "Of course," the man said. Kevin stepped back from the door before Dale opened it. He went back to his desk and sat down and stared at the wall for a moment. Something was badly wrong. He didn't have a full picture. He had fragments, the kind that you know belong to something larger but can't quite assemble in the dark. The restricted record, Carol's face, the question about jurisdiction, the man's absolute lack of fear, that thing inside the jacket on the shoulder of the highway. Kevin opened the record system again. He ran the vehicle registration separately this time, looking for associated records. The Ferrari came back registered to a leasing company out of Virginia. He wrote the company name down on a notepad. He ran the company name. It returned a single record, a parent company registration. That parent company record also returned a classification flag. Kevin stared at the screen. 2 separate flags, the man and the car, both restricted. He pulled up the case log and looked at the body camera footage, timestamp. He requested the file. It loaded. He watched 38 seconds of it, the moment on the shoulder where Dale had reached past the man to open the car door and the mirror housing had cracked. He rewound it and watched it again. He closed the laptop. Dale came back to the break room looking like a man who'd won something but couldn't quite celebrate it yet. He poured himself coffee and stood by the window that overlooked the parking lot. Renfrew had gone home. Shupe was doing paperwork in the corner. The station was quiet in the way stations get late at night. Not peaceful, just subdued, the day's energy settling into something duller. "He didn't break," Dale said, mostly to himself. Shupe looked up briefly and then looked back at his work. "Most people, you put them in that room for a couple hours. Something shifts," Dale said. "Tone changes, or they start negotiating. Or they want to make a deal. He sat there and asked me about jurisdictional agreements." He shook his head. "Like I was the one being interviewed." "You think he's a lawyer?" Shupe said. "He knows legal procedure too cold for a regular person," Dale said. "But no, it's not that." "Then what?" Dale drank his coffee. "I don't know, but I caught him, didn't I? Car's been impounded. He's in holding. The search didn't turn up the product yet, but that doesn't mean it isn't there." "Could be a hidden compartment. I've seen those before, in cars exactly like that." He said it firmly. The way a man says something firmly when he's trying to keep himself from hearing the doubt underneath. Kevin appeared in the doorway. "Dale, can I ask you something?" "What?" "Did you see the flag on his record when Carol ran it?" "Classification flags happen all the time, Kevin. Data entry errors, crossed records. It doesn't mean anything." "2 separate flags," Kevin said. "Him and the car both." Dale set his coffee down. He looked at Kevin with an expression that was patient on the surface and something harder underneath. "Are you done processing the intake?" "Yes." "Then get some rest. You're overthinking." "I just think we should make sure before—" "Kevin," Dale said, and the patience in his voice was entirely gone now, replaced by something flat and absolute. I've been doing this 14 years. I know when I've made a good arrest. Get some rest." Kevin held the doorway for a second, then nodded once and left. Dale picked his coffee back up. So he looked out the parking lot window at the night and the far yellow glow of the highway and the dark tree line beyond it. It was close to midnight when Kevin came back to the holding cell. He had a cup of water and a protein bar from the vending machine. Not an unusual offering, just something to do with his hands. He slid the water through the slot, and the man took it without comment. "You doing all right?" Kevin asked. "Fine," the man said. Kevin stood there for a moment. The corridor was empty behind him. The station had quieted down to almost nothing. "The search came back clean," Kevin said, "in case you didn't know." "I know," the man said. "No drugs, no illegal items. The car was clean all the way through." "Yes," the man said. Kevin watched him. "You're not going to tell me anything, are you?" "Not yet," the man said. He looked at Kevin directly through the slot, and his eyes were serious but not unfriendly. "But you've already noticed what you need to notice." Kevin frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" The man was quiet for a moment, looking at the far wall. Then he looked back at Kevin, and his voice dropped just a degree lower, not conspiratorial, deliberate. "You still have time to fix this," he said. "He doesn't." Kevin stood in the corridor for a long moment after that, turning those words over in his head. He put his hand on the door to leave, then stopped. He looked back. "The flag's on your record," Kevin said, "and on the car." The man waited. "Classification level federal," Kevin said. The man said nothing. He just held eye contact, and in the flatness of that hold, Kevin found his answer. He left without another word. He walked down the corridor and past the desk where Carol was doing the end-of-shift handover with the night officer. She glanced at Kevin as he passed. Her face carried that same look she'd had earlier, not alarmed exactly, but unresolved, like a sentence she hadn't been allowed to finish. Kevin gave her a small nod and kept walking until he was through the side door and in the parking lot, and the air was cold and sharp, and he could hear the highway distantly through the trees. He looked up at the sky for a moment. The stars were out. The kind of clear, still night that made the daytime feel like it had happened a long time ago. Then he took out his notepad and looked at what he'd written. The leasing company, the parent company name, the 2 classification flags. Below that, a question he'd written in shorthand. Why this road? But why this car? Why today? He didn't have answers, but he had the feeling, the specific, low, durable feeling, that the answers existed somewhere already, fully formed, waiting for him to find them. He put the notepad back in his pocket and stood in the cold for another minute. Inside, in the system nobody had checked again since Carol first ran it that evening, the name in the database sat quietly with its federal classification tag. Somewhere above the local network, in a database that required a different level of clearance to access, the full record waited, with its photograph, its active status marker, and the 2-word designation that would have changed everything the moment Dale Pruett had made the call to pull over a red Ferrari on a forest highway that Thursday afternoon. The night officer at the desk settled in for his shift. He poured coffee from the same pot that had been burning since 6 in the evening and didn't notice the difference. The man in holding sat with his back against the wall. His eyes were open and fixed on nothing in particular. He wasn't sleeping. He was thinking the way people think when the clock matters, not anxiously, but with a kind of locked-in precision, running through timelines, weighing what had already been lost against what might still be saved. And somewhere in the quiet dark of the station's server logs, the access attempt that Carol had started and never finished sat like a held breath, waiting for someone to let it out. The first call came in at 6:14 in the morning. Kevin had been at his desk for 20 minutes by then, working on his second coffee, and not much else. He hadn't slept well. He'd gone home around 1. He lay on top of his bed in his clothes and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours before giving up and driving back in. Nobody had asked him why he was early. Nobody had asked him much of anything. The night officer, a quiet man named Briggs, had taken the call and immediately looked uncertain about it. He held the receiver slightly away from his ear, the way people do when the voice on the other end is speaking with an authority that makes you want some distance from it. "It's asking for the watch commander," Briggs said, to no one in particular. Sergeant Wills was the watch commander on the early rotation. He came out of his office in the back, still holding his own coffee, and took the receiver. Kevin watched his face from across the room. Whatever was being said on the other end, Wills was only nodding. Not the nod of someone agreeing, the nod of someone receiving information they weren't prepared for and don't know how to respond to. "I understand," Wills said once. "Yes, I understand." Then he handed the receiver back to Briggs and stood there for a moment. He looked at the holding corridor, then at Kevin. "What time was that man brought in last night?" Wills asked. "Around 9:45, Kevin said. Wills looked at the corridor again and said nothing. He went back into his office and closed the door, and Kevin heard the low murmur of another call starting up behind it. 20 minutes later, a second call came in on the main line. Briggs took it again, and this time his face went from uncertain to something closer to pale. "It's from a federal office," Briggs said, quieter this time. Asking to confirm a name against last night's intake log. Kevin put his coffee down. "Tell them to hold," Kevin said. He walked to Wills's office and knocked twice. The door opened immediately, like Wills had been standing just behind it. "There's a federal call on the main line asking about the intake," Kevin said. Wills looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked past Kevin to the desk and took the call himself. His voice stayed professional and steady, but Kevin noticed his hand on the desk, fingers pressed flat against the surface, holding something back. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Wills hung up, he turned to Kevin, and his face had the look of a man who has just understood that something much larger than what he'd thought was standing in the room with him. "Wake up, Pruett," he said. Dale arrived at the station at 7:22 with the manner of a man who expected to be praised. He had clearly showered and changed, pressed collar, fresh shave, and he walked in through the side door with his chin up, the way he did on days he felt like he'd done something worth remembering. He acknowledged Briggs with a chin lift. He looked at Kevin at the desk and gave a satisfied half nod. Wills was waiting for him in the corridor. "My office," Wills said. Something about the flatness in his voice made Dale's chin drop just slightly. He followed Wills in without comment. Kevin watched the door close behind them. He didn't try to listen. He didn't need to. He could track the emotional temperature of the room through the walls, and right now it was dropping fast. While they were in there, Kevin turned back to his computer. He had more to do. The 2 restricted flags had kept him up all night, and he had worked through the problem methodically the way he'd been trained to think, in sequence, ruling things out. He'd already established that both records were restricted at the federal level. That wasn't common. That wasn't a data entry error. He pulled up the case file for the impounded Ferrari. The vehicle had been logged in the impound lot at 10:17 the previous night. Standard inventory conducted by night shift. The inventory log listed the contents checked: front compartment, main cabin, glove box, rear shelf, all noted as empty or standard. Kevin looked at the log for a long time. He thought about what the man had said, federal property. He thought about the leasing company registered out of Virginia. He thought about the parent company flag. He ran the parent company name through a general public records database, not the department system, but the state business registry. The result returned a registered LLC, active status, no listed officers, with a registered agent address in Northern Virginia that Kevin recognized as a common front address used by companies that didn't want their real location known. It wasn't definitive, but it was a thread. He printed the page, folded it, and put it in the same pocket as his notepad. The office door opened 20 minutes later. Dale came out first, and whatever had been said in there had taken something out of him. He moved differently, still upright, but the lightness was gone. He walked past Kevin without the nod and went to his desk and sat down heavily and looked at the surface. Kevin gave it 2 minutes. Then he walked over. "How'd it go?" he said. "Fine," Dale said. "What did they want?" "Nothing. Some follow-up on the federal call. Sarge is handling it." "Dale." "I said it's handled, Kevin." Kevin sat on the edge of the adjacent desk and crossed his arms and looked at his partner. Dale was staring at the surface of his own desk like there was something written on it. "The body cam footage from the shoulder," Kevin said. "I watched it last night." Dale's jaw moved slightly. "The mirror," Kevin said. "The way the door was approached, the sequence of the search, before any consent was given, before any warrant was discussed. I had probable cause." "Based on what?" Kevin said. "Because I watched 40 seconds of that footage and I couldn't find it." Dale looked up. His eyes were hard and direct. "You've been a cop for 3 years, Kevin. You don't know every angle yet." "I know what I saw," Kevin said. They held eye contact for a moment. Then Dale looked away first, which was unusual enough that Kevin cataloged it. "The man in holding said something to me last night," Kevin said. He kept his voice low and even, not accusatory. "He said, and I'm quoting, 'You still have time to fix this.'" "He doesn't." Dale said nothing. "I think he knows exactly what's happening," Kevin said. "I think he's known since the moment you put the cuffs on him, and I think whatever is attached to his record and that car, it's bigger than anything we've dealt with here." Silence. "We need to look at those flags, Dale. We need to let Wills see the full record." "The full record is restricted," Dale said. His voice was clipped, controlled. "Which means we're not cleared to see it." "Which means it's not our business." "It is our business when it walked through our door last night in handcuffs," Kevin said. Dale stood up, and for a moment Kevin thought the conversation was about to become something else entirely. But Dale just put on his jacket and said, "I'm getting breakfast," and walked out. Kevin watched him go. At 9:30, the man in holding was brought to the interrogation room again, not by Dale, who still wasn't back, but by Kevin, who had gotten clearance from Wills for a follow-up documentation review. It was the thinnest procedural justification Kevin had used in 3 years, and Wills had granted it with a look that said he knew exactly what Kevin was doing. The man sat down across from Kevin. He looked like he'd slept, which was more than Kevin had managed. "I'm not here to interrogate you," Kevin said. He put no folder on the table. He folded his hands. "I just want to look you in the eye and ask you one question, and I'd like an honest answer." The man waited. "Did I do something wrong last night?" Kevin said. "Not him, me. Did I make an error in judgment that made this worse?" The man was quiet for a moment, studying Kevin's face with the same calm, comprehensive attention he gave everything. "You followed a bad lead without enough pushback," he said. "You noticed the right things at the right moments, but didn't act on them fast enough. That's not the same as wrongdoing, but it's not nothing." Kevin nodded slowly. He wasn't defensive about it. "The flag's on your record," Kevin said, "and on the car. I found the parent company. The Virginia address." Something in the man's expression shifted, just fractionally, just enough for Kevin to catch it. A recalibration. He was updating his read on Kevin. "You're more careful than your partner," the man said. "I'd like to think I'm more careful than a lot of people," Kevin said. "What I can't figure out is whether that helps or hurts right now." "Right now," the man said, "it helps." He looked at the camera in the corner of the room, the red recording light, steady. Then he looked back at Kevin. "There are things I can't tell you in this room, on that recording. What I can tell you is this: the errors made last night, the ones in procedure, in judgment, in how that vehicle was treated, there is a paper trail forming, and it's forming whether your partner acknowledges it or not." Kevin leaned back slightly. "The body cam footage?" Kevin asked. "Among other things," the man said. "The crowd on the shoulder, the phones, the sequence of the search. Every procedural deviation is documented somewhere." He paused. "There are also people who know where I am. They've been patient because they understand field situations, but patience has a limit." Kevin looked at the table between them. He thought about the first call that had come in at 6:14 and the second one, and Wills's flattened face when he'd hung up. "What happens when patience runs out?" Kevin said. The man looked at him evenly. "You've already seen the beginning of it." The unmarked vehicles appeared in the parking lot around 11. There were two of them, dark gray sedans, clean and identical in the way that fleet vehicles get when the organization buying them doesn't want to be identified. They parked at the far end of the lot near the fence and didn't move. Nobody got out. Briggs noticed them first and mentioned it to Kevin quietly. Kevin went to the window and looked. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to Wills's office and knocked. "I see them," Wills said before Kevin could say anything. He was standing at his own window, looking out. "I've been watching them for 20 minutes. "Who are they?" Kevin asked. "I don't know yet," Wills said. "But I have a feeling we're about to find out." It was the second cop, the one they'd started calling Renfrew's replacement after Renfrew moved shifts, who pulled the body cam file for internal review. His name was Dobbs, and he was mid-40s and had a reputation for being thorough in exactly the way that made some officers avoid working with him. He watched the full 47 minutes of footage from Dale's camera. Kevin was in the adjacent room when Dobbs came out of the viewing station. Dobbs didn't say anything. He just looked at Kevin with an expression that carried a specific weight, the weight of a man who has just watched something he cannot unknow. "What's your ruling?" Kevin said. "Not mine to rule," Dobbs said, "but I'll tell you what I saw." He set the tablet down on the desk between them. "I saw a search initiated without consent and without a documented warrant justification. I saw property damage occurring within the context of that search. I saw the detainee ask one legal question and the arresting officer respond to that question by escalating." He tapped the tablet. "I also saw a charge of obstruction applied to a person who said 14 words during the entire encounter before being placed in cuffs." Kevin said nothing. "14 words," Dobbs said again. "I counted." Kevin looked at the tablet. On the screen, frozen, was the moment on the shoulder. The man on his knees, hands behind his back, the broken mirror hanging at its wrong angle in the background. He looked at it for a long time. The confirmation came through the department's secure terminal at 11:47 in the morning. Kevin was at his desk when the notification flag came up in the system. It was attached to the main case file, not a pop-up, not an alert, just a quiet line of new text appearing in the record field that had been restricted since the night before. The restriction hadn't been removed, but a partial clearance had been applied, enough for certain personnel to view a summary classification. Kevin read it once. He read it again. He stood up slowly, looked around the room, and sat back down. The words were plain and brief. No dramatic formatting, no flashing indicators. Just a name, an active status designation, and 2 words in a classification field that changed everything that had happened in the last 14 hours. active federal operative. He sat with it for a moment, the specific, airless feeling of a thing you had suspected becoming a thing you now knew. The flags, the restricted records, the Virginia leasing company, the man's behavior in interrogation and holding, the calls that had started coming in at 6 in the morning, all of it assembled itself into a single coherent shape. Kevin thought about the broken mirror on the shoulder. The 14 words. He printed the summary page, stood up, and walked to Wills's office. Word moved through the station the way things move through small spaces, not by announcement, but by presence. A look held too long between two people. A conversation that stopped when someone walked past. The specific silence that settles over a room when the information in it is more serious than the people are prepared to handle. By noon, most of the officers on shift knew something was wrong. Not the details, just the shape of it. That the man in holding was not what Dale had presented him as. That the cars in the parking lot were still there. And that Wills had been in and out of his office 3 times in an hour with the expression of a man managing something large and fragile at the same time. Dale came back from breakfast at 11:53. He walked in through the side door and got as far as the middle of the room before he noticed the quality of the silence. It was a particular kind of silence, not the quiet of a slow morning, but the quiet of a room that knows something the person walking into it doesn't. Dale had been a cop for 14 years. He knew the difference. His pace slowed by half a step before he'd consciously decided it. He looked at Kevin. Kevin was standing near the printer with a folded piece of paper in his hand, and his expression was the most neutral Kevin had managed all morning. No judgment in it, but no warmth either. "What?" Dale said. "Come with me," Kevin said. He showed Dale the summary clearance in Wills's office, with Wills present. He laid the printed page on the desk and pointed to the classification line and watched Dale read it. Dale read it. His face went through several things quickly. Disbelief, then the specific compression that happens when a man tries to maintain a position that the facts have just undercut, then something that looked briefly like fear before settling back into a rigid kind of denial. He set the page down and pushed it slightly away from him, as if putting a few more inches between himself and it would change what it said. "That could be a system error," Dale said. "Classification mismatches happen. Records get crossed." 2 separate records, Kevin said. The man and the car. Both flagged. Both federal. The car is registered to a parent company out of Northern Virginia with a federal-facing registered agent. That doesn't prove—" "Dale," Will said. One word, level and final. Dale stopped. "This is no longer a local matter," Will said. "It may not have been a local matter from the moment you pulled that car over." He looked at Dale steadily. "I need you to sit down, and I need you to walk me through every decision you made yesterday, from the moment you initiated that stop. Every one, in sequence." Dale stood there for a moment. His jaw was tight. He had the look of a man who understood on some level that the ground under him had changed, but whose body hadn't caught up yet, was still standing the same way it always had, still waiting for things to go back to the shape he knew. He sat down. Kevin stepped back toward the wall, out of the way, and let Wills run the room. At 12:30, one of the gray sedans in the parking lot finally moved. It didn't leave. It repositioned, pulling forward to face the station entrance more directly. Kevin watched it from the window near his desk and thought about the man in holding who had sat through the night and the morning in a concrete room and said the minimum required and had not once looked like someone who had lost. He thought about the Ferrari sitting in the impound lot 2 blocks over. The search inventory had listed the car's contents as standard: front compartment, cabin, glove box, rear shelf. Kevin had read it 3 times. But the Ferrari 296 GTB had a design feature that was specific to the model, and that night shift's inventory officer would not necessarily know to check for: a secondary storage compartment behind the rear shelf panel, accessible only by a specific release sequence. Kevin had looked it up at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. He'd gone through the manufacturer's documentation. He went to Wills's office again. The discussion about the Ferrari's secondary compartment lasted 11 minutes. Wills called the impound lot and told them not to move the car, not to conduct any further searches, and not to allow anyone access to it without his direct authorization. He used a tone Kevin had not heard from him before, not loud, just absolute. The kind of voice that comes from someone who has just understood the full weight of a mistake and is trying very carefully to stop anything else from going wrong. Then Wills looked at Kevin and said, "We should have caught this last night." "Yes," Kevin said. "Who ran the initial inventory?" "Briggs, on night shift." Wills nodded slowly. He wasn't blaming Briggs. He was accounting for the full chain, building the picture of how many things had gone sideways and in what order, the way you have to before you can explain it to anyone who outranks you. "The car being tied to an operative," Kevin said. "If it's part of an active operation, then we may have disrupted it," Wills said. "Yes." He looked out his window at the parking lot. The gray sedan sat still and patient. "That's what I'm trying to understand the scope of before those people come inside." Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, where the man had been moved again for what the records would describe as a documentation review, Dale had asked to speak with him. Kevin had not been present for this request. He found out about it from Dobbs, who had been in the corridor when Dale made the ask and who had the specific look of someone storing information away. Kevin went to find Wills. "He wants to talk to him," Kevin said. "I told him no," Wills said. "He went anyway." Kevin moved. He got to the interrogation room in time to see Dale through the door window, already seated across from the man. Dale's posture was wrong. Shoulders too far forward, elbows on the table. The body language of a man trying to negotiate from a position that no longer existed. Kevin pushed the door open. Both men looked up. The man in the chair looked at Kevin with the same measuring calm he always did. Dale looked at Kevin with something between irritation and the earliest shape of something he didn't want to name. "I need a minute," Dale said. "You've had a minute," Kevin said. "This isn't appropriate, Dale. Not now, not given what we know. I just want to clarify." "There's nothing to clarify here," Kevin said. "Not in this room, not with him." Dale looked at the man across the table. His expression shifted, something complicated moving through it, something close to what Kevin had seen from him only a handful of times in 2 years, in the specific moments when Dale's certainty failed him. "You knew the whole time," Dale said to the man. "Not accusing, just acknowledging." The man looked at him for a moment. "I knew who I was," he said quietly. "I gave you every opportunity to find out." Dale sat with that. Then he stood up, and Kevin moved out of the doorway to let him through, and Dale walked back down the corridor without looking at anyone. Kevin stood in the doorway for a moment after Dale had gone. The man sat at the table, still and measured, hands resting flat. The recording light on the camera was red. "You should know," Kevin said, "that the car is secured. I flagged the secondary compartment issue to my sergeant. Nobody's touched it." Something in the man's posture changed. A small but real release of tension, so brief that you'd miss it if you weren't watching carefully. "That matters," the man said. "How much?" Kevin said. The man looked at him steadily. "More than you know right now." He paused. "You weren't the problem here. I want you to understand that clearly." Kevin nodded. "But you're about to be part of it if you stay silent," the man said. "About what you saw on that footage, about the flags, about the sequence of events." His voice was even, not threatening, clinical in the way of someone laying out facts that are already true regardless of what anyone does with them. "What happened here is going to be examined by people with more authority than anyone in this building. The record is going to matter." "I know," Kevin said. "Your record," the man said. "What you noticed, what you reported, what you did when you had the choice." He held Kevin's gaze. "That's what's going to define where you land in all of this." Kevin stood in the doorway for another second. Then he went back to his desk and opened a new document and started writing. Everything he'd observed, in sequence, with timestamps, beginning at the moment he and Dale had pulled out of the parking lot the previous afternoon toward a quiet stretch of forest highway. The black SUVs came at 1:45 in the afternoon, not 2, 4. They pulled into the Harlow County Sheriff's Station parking lot in a loose convoy and parked in a way that blocked the main exit without being dramatic about it. The gray sedans that had been sitting there all morning seemed to acknowledge them. There was something in the positioning that looked deliberate, like pieces on a board that had been waiting for the rest to arrive. The engines cut off one by one in quick succession, and for a moment the lot was completely still. The officers who had been at their desks or in the break room drifted toward windows. Kevin stayed at his desk. He already knew what was coming. He kept writing. The first person through the door was a woman, mid-40s, sharp jacket, the kind of posture that belongs to someone who is always the most prepared person in any room she walks into. She was followed by 2 men in similar attire, and behind them, 2 uniformed federal agents. She walked to the duty desk and showed credentials that made Briggs stand up straighter. "I'm looking for the watch commander," she said. Wills was already in the corridor. "That's me," he said. "I need your full cooperation, and I need it immediately," she said. Not unkindly, simply absolutely. "You have a detained individual who needs to be released. I also need your impound lot secured, and I need every piece of documentation related to last night's stop. Body cam, intake, case file, pulled and held. Nothing leaves this building without my signature." Wills said, "Of course." She looked around the room. Her eyes moved over the officers who had drifted to doorways and windows, and the look she gave them was not hostile, but was completely clear. This room is now operating under different authority. She looked at Kevin at his desk. He met her eyes. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to be intentional, and then moved with Wills toward the back. Kevin went back to his document. In the corridor, Dale stood at the edge of the holding wing, watching the agents move through his station. He stood straight. He looked composed. But Kevin had worked with him for 2 years, and he knew the difference between Dale being composed and Dale holding himself together by force of will. This was the second one. One of the federal agents passed Dale in the corridor and paused to look at him. Not aggressively, just with the clean attention of someone confirming a data point. Then the agent kept walking. Dale watched them go. From the direction of holding, there was a sound of a door being unlocked, and from down the corridor, Kevin heard footsteps. Measured, unhurried, the specific cadence of a man who had been sitting in a concrete room for 16 hours and was now walking out of it, not as a detainee, but as someone who had just become the most important person in the building. The holding wing door opened at 1:53 in the afternoon. The operative walked out the way he had walked into everything else, at his own pace, carrying nothing that wasn't already his. He had his jacket back, returned by one of the federal agents who had moved through processing ahead of him. He put it on in the corridor while the lead agent, whose name was Sandra Okafor, stood 2 steps back and waited. She didn't rush him. She understood field personnel. She understood what 16 hours in a county holding cell did to a person's internal clock, the specific way time compressed and expanded in a concrete room with no windows and a flickering fluorescent overhead. She let him take 30 seconds to button his jacket and look down the corridor and adjust before she said, simply, "We need a room." Wills gave them the conference room at the back of the station, the one used for quarterly reviews and the occasional press briefing, long enough to seat 8 with room to spare. Sandra brought in 2 of her agents and left the other 2 in the lot. She looked at Kevin standing near the door and said, "You, come in." Kevin came in. Dale was not invited. He was still in the hallway when the door closed, and Kevin caught a last glimpse of him through the narrow window, sitting against the wall in a chair, forearms on his knees, staring at the floor between his feet. He looked like a man who had been waiting for something to resolve itself and was beginning to understand that it wouldn't. Sandra Okafor did not waste time on preamble. "The man you arrested yesterday," she said, addressing Wills directly, "is an 11-year FBI operative currently embedded in a multi-state trafficking investigation covering 4 jurisdictions. His cover identity and his movements over the past 8 months have been coordinated through our field office. The vehicle, the Ferrari, was a sanctioned operational asset. It was not his personal property. It was not purchased with his funds. It was built, registered, and maintained specifically for this operation." She set a tablet on the table. On the screen was a photograph of the car's interior, specifically the rear panel of the cabin, pulled away to reveal a cavity roughly the size of a document case. The agent sitting across from Kevin had clearly seen this before, but Kevin had not, and he looked at it for a moment before he could pull his eyes back to Sandra. "Evidence chains," she said. "Tracking hardware tied to a distribution network currently operating across 3 states. Documentation linking 3 mid-level distributors to a single supply source operating out of this county. A communications device registered to a federal frequency that has been active in the field for the past 4 months." She looked around the table carefully, pausing on each face. "All of it was intact this morning when we accessed the vehicle. Intact, but barely." "We secured the impound lot," Wills said, "as soon as we understood the vehicle's status." "At 9:45 this morning," Sandra said. Not accusing, just marking the time, the way someone marks a mile marker on a road, not to assign blame for how long it took to get there, but because the distance matters. "Approximately 19 hours after the stop," she continued. Wills nodded. He didn't try to soften it or explain it away. He received it the way a man receives an uncomfortable fact he has already accepted as true. The operative sat at the far end of the table, hands resting flat on either side of a water cup, the same contained stillness he had carried through the entire previous night. Kevin had been watching him since the shoulder of the highway. He was still watching him now, and what he kept noticing was the same thing he'd noticed from the beginning, the way the man took in every room without appearing to look at anything in particular. Sandra turned to him. "Marcus," she said, and it was the first time anyone in this building had used his name out loud. "Walk us through your position at the time of the stop." Marcus Ellison. The name settled into the room quietly and completely, the way a missing piece settles when it finally finds its place. "I was returning from a meet," Marcus said. His voice carried the ease of a man speaking to people who understand his context without requiring explanation. "I had made contact with a mid-level coordinator who has been feeding us logistics information over the past 6 weeks. The meeting was clean, no surveillance concerns, no indication of compromise. The documents in the secondary compartment were what I'd received that afternoon. New routing data for a distribution hub operating out of a warehouse facility approximately 40 miles north of where I was stopped." He let that sit for a moment. "I was 40 minutes from our field handoff point," he said. "I would have transferred the materials by 5 o'clock. By 6, the data would have been processed." "But we would have had enough to move on the hub within 36 hours. He paused. "Instead," he said, without particular emotion, "I spent the night in holding." No one said anything for a moment. The weight of the arithmetic was simple and complete. 36 hours from a breakthrough, brought to a stop by a man who had made a decision based on nothing more substantial than the color of a car and the assumptions that came with it. One of Sandra's agents, a younger man named Perkins, looked up from his tablet. "The hub, what's the status?" Sandra looked at Marcus. "The coordinator I met will have noticed I didn't make the handoff," Marcus said. He's careful. If I don't show without explanation, his protocol is to assume the channel is compromised. He set the cup down. He'll have reported that up by midnight last night at the latest. So the hub has been warned, Will said. It's possible. It's also possible they waited to see if it was a routine disruption. Either way, the window we had is gone. 8 months of work, Kevin said quietly, almost to himself. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but he didn't pull it back. Because of a stop on a highway, no warrant, no evidence. Marcus looked at him steadily. There was no anger in his face, no bitterness, something flatter and harder and more durable than either. Yes, Marcus said. Kevin sat back. Dale Pruett's name entered the room 20 minutes into the briefing, through a question Sandra asked about the actual basis for the stop. Not the legal basis, she said, the real one. Wills walked through it accurately and without editorializing, and the picture that emerged was clear enough that it didn't need commentary. When Wills finished, Sandra was quiet for a moment. One officer's decision, she said. Yes. No supervisor authorization, no radio consultation before the stop. No. And the vehicle damage occurred during the search. It's on the body cam, Kevin said. The mirror housing was struck when the officer reached past the detainee to access the door. The search was conducted without documented probable cause and before consent was given. Sandra looked at Kevin. You reviewed the footage last night? Yes. Before the classification was cleared? Yes. She made a note. The stop was not random, Marcus said then. The words landed flatly in the center of the room. Sandra looked at him. Explain. I've run the same route on the same day of the week for 6 weeks. Same car, same window, same direction. Consistency builds cover. Anyone observing that pattern could predict exactly when and where I'd be on that road. He let that breathe for a moment. The stop happened at the one point on that route with no traffic camera coverage. The room went still. Someone tipped them, Perkins said. I'm identifying a pattern, Marcus said carefully. What it means is a separate question. Sandra underlined something on her tablet and looked at Wills. I need your officer's full case history. Stops, arrests, incident reports, everything from the last 2 years. And I need it today. Of course, Wills said. Kevin glanced at the door's narrow window. The hallway was empty. Dale had moved. They released the conference room at 3:15. Kevin went back to his desk and added 3 paragraphs to the time-stamped log he'd been building since that morning. Marcus passed his desk on the way out and paused. You secured the impound lot, Marcus said. I flagged the compartment to my sergeant. He made the call. How did you know about the compartment? Manufacturer documentation, Kevin said. I looked it up at 2 a.m. Marcus studied him for a moment. Then something in his expression, not warm exactly, but adjacent to it, shifted just slightly. Good work, Marcus said, and he kept walking. Kevin stared at his screen for a while after that. Sandra Okafor's team had the conference room converted into a field operations base before 4 o'clock. Cable ran along the baseboard, the 2 laptops connected to a portable satellite terminal, and within 40 minutes, that county conference room had more federal computing power in it than most regional offices. Sandra came to Kevin's desk at 4:20. We'd like your read on a few things, she said. Local geography. You know this area. Reasonably well, Kevin said. That's more than we have. He followed her in. Dale Pruett was placed on administrative leave at 4:47. Wills delivered it. Kevin wasn't in the room, but he learned from Dobbs, who documented the action. Dale left the building through the same side door he'd come through that morning in a pressed collar, carrying his confidence like something he'd earned. He didn't say anything to anyone on the way out. Kevin watched him cross the parking lot from across the room, and Dale never looked back. Kevin turned back to his screen. It was Perkins who connected the pattern first. He was running Dale's arrest history, pulled at Sandra's request. Cross-referenced with a second list Kevin recognized from the edge of the screen as FBI field operation logs. He stared at the overlapping data for a long moment. "He's done this before," Perkins said quietly. Sandra came to stand behind him. Kevin leaned slightly from his chair. 3 incidents, Perkins said. 14 months ago, 9 months ago, and now. All 3 stops involved vehicles on a federal surveillance list. 2 of the 3 resulted in arrests that were later dropped without explanation. "He stopped federal assets," Sandra said. 3 times. "Without knowing it?" Kevin said from across the room. "Or knowing it," Perkins said. The room held that. Kevin thought about Dale cutting Carol off before she could read the flag, the specific decision to speak at that specific moment, before the classification could be announced in front of others. He'd taken that for ego at the time. Control. Dale managing information in his own space the way he always did. He turned it over again now. "The first 2 stops," Kevin said. "What happened after them?" Perkins checked. "First, arrested person released within 24 hours. Charges dropped by the county DA citing insufficient evidence." He scrolled. "Second, vehicle held in impound 11 days before release. No charges filed." "During those 11 days," Marcus said from the map table, "did any operations in this county go sideways?" Perkins was quiet a moment. "There's a note from a field office. A surveillance target relocated unexpectedly during that window, flagged as anomalous." Marcus looked at the ceiling briefly. Kevin felt something settle in his chest, heavy and cold, the specific feeling of a thing you'd hoped would stay theoretical, becoming real. "Pull his financials," Kevin said. Sandra was already reaching for her phone. The field operation launched at 6 in the evening. Marcus led it. 2 of Sandra's field-capable agents alongside him, Kevin in an unmarked sedan, running local support and radio relay. He wasn't armed, nobody offered, and he didn't ask. They drove north on the highway. Kevin watched the shoulder as they passed the stretch where the Ferrari had been pulled over the previous afternoon. The gravel was still disturbed. A small piece of broken carbon fiber housing sat near the tree line where it had skittered and stopped when the mirror was broken, and nobody had picked it up, and it sat there in the early evening light looking like exactly what it was. A small piece of something that should still be whole. He looked away. The warehouse district sat 6 miles past the gas station. Corrugated metal buildings on a county access road, registered to 3 separate shell companies that Perkins had spent 2 hours mapping before the operation launched. The road to get there was narrow and badly maintained, the kind of county access road that shows up on maps, but that most people drive past the junction of without noticing. Kevin had driven it twice before in 3 years on the force. Once for a routine complaint, once following up a stolen vehicle report that had gone nowhere. He knew the gate at the junction, the way the road curved before the buildings came into view, the gravel lot and the dock doors on the east side of the second building. The target facility was that second building from the north end. When they arrived, one of the 2 registered vehicles was gone. Marcus stopped the convoy 200 yards out. He pulled the field glasses from inside his jacket and scanned the lot in a slow, deliberate arc. He was quiet for 30 seconds. Kevin watched the lot with his naked eye. 1 panel van near the dock doors, gravel empty where a second vehicle should have been. Dock doors closed, no visible movement at the windows. 1 vehicle left, Marcus said, the panel van. The sedan is gone. Could have left for the day, one of the agents said. Could have, Marcus said. He didn't sound like he believed it. He lowered the glasses and looked at the facility for another moment, at the dock doors, at the windows, at the quality of stillness around the building, which was the kind of stillness that comes from a place being recently vacated rather than simply quiet. We go in." They cleared the facility in 11 minutes. Kevin stayed at the vehicles per Sandra's instruction, watching the exits and maintaining radio contact with the team inside. He heard the entry through his earpiece, the side door, the brief exchange as the team announced themselves, the voices of the two low-level workers inside who did not run and who sounded more confused than scared. Then the systematic movement through the space. By room, each section confirmed clear in sequence. When Marcus came back out through the side door, Kevin could read the result in his posture before he said anything. The person they were looking for was not there. Marcus stood in the parking lot for a moment and looked at the building and then at the road, and then at nothing in particular, doing the internal accounting that field operatives do when a target has slipped. Then he went back in, and Kevin followed him this time. The warehouse floor was large and high-ceilinged, lit by industrial panels overhead, the air carrying the smell of cardboard and something chemical and the particular dry quality of a space that moves product. There were materials throughout: packaging, documentation, sealed containers the forensics team would need, evidence of an active operation that had been running for some time. But there was also evidence of something else: empty shelving units with clean rectangles in the dust where boxes had been stacked until recently. A desk in the far corner with a monitor still faintly warm when Kevin pressed the back of his hand near the exhaust vent. A power strip with 3 cables still plugged into it, but nothing attached to the other ends. Pulled loose in a hurry, the devices they'd powered no longer in the room. Someone had been here 2 or 3 hours ago doing a very deliberate kind of cleaning. Marcus stood in the middle of the floor and took it all in without moving. He looked at the clean rectangles in the dust. He looked at the warm monitor. He looked at the unplugged cables. "They knew we were coming," Sandra said from behind him. "Yes," Marcus said. "How far ahead?" "Long enough to clear the desk and load a vehicle carefully," Marcus said. "Not a panic clear. A planned one. 2 hours, maybe 3. Kevin looked at his watch and ran it back. 2 or 3 hours ago put them squarely in the early portion of Sandra's briefing, the point at which the operation's target location had first been discussed in the conference room, with maps, with access roads named, with specificity. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was already looking at him. They drove back in near silence. Sandra on the phone in the front seat, voice low and clipped. Kevin driving, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. The trees on either side of the highway were going dark as the evening came in from the east, of the last light pulling out of the canopy in long, slow degrees. In the back seat, Marcus watched the highway pass. He hadn't said much since the warehouse. That was what Marcus did after a setback. He went inward, not with despair, but with the focused quiet of someone recalculating without emotion, finding the next usable angle before he spoke again. Kevin drove and thought. He thought about who had been in the conference room that afternoon. Wills, Sandra, Perkins, the 2 agents, Marcus and himself. 6 people, all of whom he could account for during the portion of the briefing when the facility's location was named and mapped on the wall screen with specificity, with access roads, with satellite imagery. Then he thought about who had been outside it. Where the corridor adjacent to the conference room ran the length of the station's back half and connected the break room to the records office and the rear exit. People moved through it naturally throughout the day, to get coffee, to reach the printer, to use the bathroom, to collect files. Being in that corridor during any part of the briefing would not have seemed remarkable to anyone watching, and the conference room door fit loosely in its frame. A minor maintenance issue, noted in a facilities report 2 years ago, never addressed. You could hear through it if the room wasn't particularly loud. You could see through the narrow window if you were close enough to bother looking. He thought about Carol. He turned the access attempt over again. The night of the arrest, Carol at the duty desk, running the detained man's ID, on the flag appearing. Dale cutting her off before she finished. She'd turned away. He'd watched Dale's face in that moment. Dale looking at Carol. his words direct and dismissive, the ordinary authority of a senior officer managing information in his own space. 3 or 4 seconds. Ordinary. And Carol had turned away from the screen before Dale had finished his sentence. He'd read that as compliance. Carol was careful, professional, quietly efficient, the kind of station presence that keeps things running without requiring recognition. Of course, she'd followed the instruction without pushback, but careful and professional and unobtrusive were also exactly the qualities a person needed if they were doing something they couldn't afford to be noticed doing. Kevin's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "I need to tell you something," he said. Sandra lowered the phone from her ear. Marcus looked up from the back seat. "About last night," Kevin said. "About the access attempt on the detained man's record." "Go ahead," Sandra said. "I assume Carol stopped because Dale cut her off," Kevin said. "That's how I read it at the time. Dale told her to leave it. She left it. But I was watching Dale's face when he spoke. He was looking at her when he said it. He said, 'I can hear it clearly. I'll look at it later, Carol.' 3 seconds, maybe 4. He paused. She was already turning away from the screen before he got to her name. The car was quiet for a moment. Outside, the dark trees moved past at highway speed. "Before he said her name," Marcus said from the back seat. "Yes," Kevin said, "before he finished the instruction. If you're stopping because someone told you to, you wait to hear it. You don't move before it's done." He let that sit. "She moved first." Sandra looked at him steadily from the passenger seat. "Like she was done," Kevin said. "Not interrupted. Done." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and spoke 2 sentences to whoever was on the other end. Kevin caught only the last one clearly. "Bring Carol Hendricks in," Sandra said. Back at the station, Perkins met them in the parking lot with his tablet. "Financial records came back," he said. "Preliminary review." "And," Sandra said, "Pruett's clean. Last 2 years, nothing anomalous. Spending tracks his income. No unusual deposits. No transfers." Sandra absorbed that without reaction. "He wasn't being paid," Marcus said from behind them. "Doesn't look like it." "Then he was being used, fed information, given a reason to make those stops that had nothing to do with money." Marcus looked at the station entrance. Someone pointed him at that road and gave him a reason to act on what he saw. And Dale, being Dale, did exactly what someone needed him to do. Kevin thought about Dale with his 14 years of certainty and his habit of acting on instinct. How easy it would be to use a man like that. Not with money, not with threats, just with information, delivered in a way that made him feel like he'd figured it out himself. "The intercepted message," Kevin said. "What does the relay trace look like?" Perkins turned the tablet around. "Sent through a prepaid civilian device. The tower it pinged is 3 blocks from this station." 3 blocks. Kevin looked at the station entrance, the duty desk visible through the front glass, the chair where Carol had sat the previous night when she ran a name through the system and found something she was not supposed to find, or something she'd been waiting to find. The parking lot was quiet around them. The trees beyond the fence had gone fully dark, the evening settled and complete. Somewhere on the highway, headlights moved through the trees in both directions, steady, indifferent, ordinary. Kevin stood in that quiet and felt the specific, unglamorous weight of having said the thing out loud that made something real. Behind him, Marcus said quietly, "Now you're thinking like an investigator." Kevin didn't feel like he'd done something right. He felt like someone who had just placed a stone that couldn't be unplaced. He turned to Sandra and nodded once. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked at him for a moment, the same measuring attention she'd given him since the conference room, and then she nodded back. "Come inside," she said. "We have work to do." Kevin followed her in. The parking lot fell quiet behind them, the night settling fully over the station and the trees and the highway beyond. The same highway where, 24 hours ago, a red Ferrari had been pulled to the shoulder of the road and where something much larger than a traffic stop had quietly, irrevocably begun. They brought Carol Hendricks in at 9:17 the following morning. She came voluntarily. Sandra had been deliberate about that. No patrol car, no uniformed escort, no public display. An agent had called her at home the previous evening and asked her to come in for what was described as a routine follow-up related to the previous night's processing intake. Routine follow-up. The language was chosen precisely because Carol was careful, and careful people notice when language is not routine. She had agreed without hesitation. That, too, was noted. Kevin was at his desk when she walked through the side entrance. She had her bag over one shoulder and a travel coffee cup in her hand, and she walked the way she always walked, measured, unhurried, eyes moving naturally around the room the way someone's eyes move when they know a space well and are not looking for anything in particular. Kevin watched her walk. He had known Carol for 3 years. He had worked alongside her at the duty desk, shared the break room with her, and passed her in the corridor more times than he could count. She was 41, had been with the department for 9 years, and was the kind of person who was consistently present and consistently invisible at the same time. Always there, never drawing attention, reliable in the specific way that people stop noticing reliability after enough time. He had not suspected her, not until the parking lot the night before. He looked at her now and tried to square the two versions, the Carol he'd shared coffee with for 3 years and the Carol who had turned away from a federal classification flag before Dale Pruett had finished his sentence. They didn't feel like different people. That was the part that sat wrong in his chest. Carol looked at Kevin briefly as she passed. She gave him the small nod she gave most people in the building. Then she kept walking toward the conference room, where Sandra Okafor was waiting. Kevin watched the conference room door close. He turned back to his screen and kept working. The controlled leak operation had been Sandra's idea, developed overnight with Marcus and run past the field office before dawn. The mechanics of it were straightforward. Feed a specific piece of false operational information to a defined group of people inside the station. Information specific enough to be actionable, false enough that any movement on it would be instantly recognizable as a response to the leak. Then, watch the channels. Marcus had been against it initially, not the concept, but the timing. They were already behind. The hub had been cleared. Every hour spent on internal housekeeping was an hour the network had to reorganize. "If the mole stays active, we can't run anything," Sandra had said. "Every operation we build from here gets compromised before it launches. We fix this first." Marcus had been quiet for a moment. Then he'd nodded. He understood operational necessity. He didn't have to like it. Kevin had been included in the planning session, seated against the wall, more observer than participant, but present. Sandra had included him deliberately. He was the one who'd surfaced the Carol lead. He understood the local personnel in a way the federal team didn't, and he had demonstrated, across the past 36 hours, a quality that Sandra valued above most others in the people she worked with: the willingness to say the uncomfortable true thing clearly, without hedging. The false information was simple: a new contact name for the coordinator Marcus had met 2 days prior, along with a suggested meeting location and time 48 hours out. The name was fictional. The location was a parking structure in the next county that the FBI had under continuous surveillance. It was fed to a list of 9 people inside the station who had been in or adjacent to the conference room during the previous day's briefing. Carol was on the list. So was Wills, Perkins, Dobbs, Briggs, and 4 others. The method was an internal memo, standard department format, routed through the shared system, time-stamped, automatically logged. Everybody on the list received it at the same time. Then they waited. The wait lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Kevin spent most of it at his desk. The station felt different, not tense exactly, but watchful, the specific quality of a space where several people are doing ordinary things while waiting for something they can't talk about. The federal analysts had their laptops open in the conference room. Perkins was running channel monitors. Sandra moved between the conference room and her temporary desk in Wills's office with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew which silences meant something and which meant nothing. Marcus was in the building but not visible. He had a way of being present without being locatable. Kevin would look up from his screen and Marcus would have shifted from one part of the station to another without anyone seeming to notice him move. At 11:42, Perkins came to the doorway of the conference room and made brief eye contact with Sandra. She stood up. Kevin watched both of them without moving. Perkins turned the laptop around so Sandra could see the screen. She read it. Her expression didn't shift, but she put her coffee cup down with the careful deliberateness of someone making sure they don't move too fast. "It moved," she said. Kevin stood up. The intercepted communication had gone out through the same prepaid relay they'd been monitoring since the previous day. The same tower, 3 blocks from the station. The content was brief and encoded, but the operational reference it contained matched the false contact name from the morning's memo exactly, a name that did not exist. In a name that had been inside the department's shared system for 4 hours and 11 minutes before it appeared in a communication sent to a trafficking network. Only 9 people had seen it. One of them had passed it on. Sandra knocked on the conference room door from the outside, which struck Kevin as strange until he understood. The conference room was where Carol was. Sandra had been conducting what she described as a documentation review, a patient and unhurried conversation that had been running for most of the morning. Carol had cooperated throughout. Her answers had been precise and carefully bounded. The answers of someone who had spent a long time thinking about what she would and wouldn't say if this moment came. Sandra opened the door and went back inside. Kevin heard nothing from the corridor. The door clicked shut. 12 minutes later, it opened again. Carol came out first, her hands in front of her, and Kevin's stomach dropped when he saw that they were not free. 2 federal agents were with her. She walked with her chin level and her eyes forward, and she did not look at Kevin as she passed his desk. He looked at her anyway. He didn't know what he was looking for, an explanation maybe, some expression that would tell him which version of Carol had been real and which had been the performance. He didn't find one. She walked past and through the side door and into the parking lot, and the agents went with her, and the door swung shut, and the sound of it was just a door. Kevin sat down slowly. Across the room, Wills was standing in his office doorway. He looked at Kevin. Kevin looked back. There was nothing to say that would make it smaller than it was, so neither of them said anything. Dale had been at home on administrative leave through all of this. He called the station at noon and asked for Wills. Kevin took the call, told him Wills was unavailable, took a message. Dale asked if something was happening. Kevin said he wasn't able to discuss active matters. Dale was quiet on the line for a moment. "Is it about me?" Dale said. "I'd recommend you speak with your union representative," Kevin said. "That's all I can tell you." Another pause. "Kevin?" "I'm sorry, Dale," Kevin said. And he was. Not for how things had turned out, but for the version of Dale who had been used by someone he'd trusted without knowing it, handed misinformation, pointed at a target, and allowed to do what he'd always done. That Dale deserved something like sympathy, even if the Dale who'd smashed a mirror and cuffed an innocent man and refused to listen to doubt didn't. He hung up. The interrogation that followed Carol's detainment lasted through the afternoon and into the early evening. Kevin was not in the room for it, but Sandra briefed him afterward in the corridor, standing near the fire exit with her jacket on and a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten about. She wasn't working alone, Sandra said. Kevin had suspected that. The intercepts were too clean. The pattern across 3 separate incidents involving Dale too consistent for a single station-level operative working on instinct. She had a handler, Sandra said, someone she communicated with through the relay. She received instructions and passed information. She didn't know the full scope of the network. She was one node. They kept her contained. How long? Kevin asked. She says 14 months, Sandra said, which lines up with the first of Dale's 3 stops. 14 months. Kevin thought about 14 months of morning shifts and break room coffee and Carol nodding at him in the corridor. 14 months of Carol at the duty desk, watching the intake system, positioned to see every flag, every record, every person brought through the side entrance. The tips to Dale, Kevin said, those came from her? Indirectly, Sandra said. She didn't contact Dale directly. The information was passed through a third party, someone Dale trusted, who fed him the target details in a way that felt like a tip from a reliable informant. She paused. So Dale genuinely believed he was acting on good intelligence. Kevin thought about that. Dale certain, confident, pressing forward on instinct that had been carefully manufactured for him. A 14-year career of genuine instinct made into a weapon by someone who understood how to aim it. The handler, Kevin said. We're working on it, Sandra said. Carol gave us partial information, enough to move on. Kevin nodded. Sandra looked at the cold coffee in her hand, seemed to notice it for the first time, and set it on the windowsill. She also confirmed the communication method used to tip off the warehouse, Sandra said. It went out through her relay approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes after our briefing started, before the facility name was ever mentioned in the room. She didn't need the facility name. She knew enough from what she'd already intercepted to warn them that the operation had been compromised and federal assets were active in the county. Kevin was quiet for a moment. She knew that from the night before. From the flag on Marcus's record, Sandra said. The moment she ran his ID and saw the classification, she knew there was an active federal operative in the building. She passed that along within the hour. The warehouse had already begun clearing by the time we were briefed the next afternoon. Kevin looked at the floor. So the warehouse had been warned not from anything said in the conference room, but from a flag on a screen at the duty desk at 9:30 on a Thursday night. From a 4-second window before Dale Pruett said a woman's name. You couldn't have caught it faster, Sandra said, as if she'd read the direction of his thoughts. I could have, Kevin said. You were a patrol officer at a county station who noticed 2 restricted flags in a database at 2 in the morning, Sandra said. You secured the impound lot. You documented everything. You identified the lead that broke this open. She looked at him directly. You did the work you were supposed to do. Kevin didn't argue with her. He just nodded and let it sit. The arrests happened across 2 days and 3 states. Sandra's team moved on the handler's location, a man named Gregory Foss, 48, a former county records clerk who had parlayed 9 years of administrative access into a second career facilitating communications between law enforcement adjacent sources and the trafficking network he served. And he was taken from his apartment on a Wednesday morning without incident. He looked smaller in person than his file suggested, Kevin thought, when Sandra showed him the booking photo afterward. They always did. The mid-level coordinator Marcus had met 2 days before the highway stop was apprehended at a motel 2 counties east, still waiting. Whatever he'd been waiting for hadn't come, and when the agents knocked on the door at 6 in the morning, he simply sat down on the edge of the bed and put his hands on his knees and looked at the carpet. 3 distributors were taken in simultaneous operations across 2 other states, coordinated out of Sandra's field office, timed to prevent any one arrest from alerting the others. Marcus had built the evidence chains across 8 months. The damage to the operation had been real and significant, but the foundation had held. Enough threads remained intact that when the time came to pull them, the structure came down. Kevin heard about most of this secondhand in the days that followed. He was back on his regular shift by then, back at his desk in the same chair, the station settling slowly into its ordinary rhythms around the edges of what had happened. The federal presence had withdrawn. Sandra's team packed their cables and their satellite terminal and their cold coffee cups, and were gone within 48 hours of Carol's detainment. The conference room became a conference room again, but the station was not the same. It couldn't be after something like this. The trust that gets broken in a place when one of the people in it turns out to be something other than what they appeared, that takes a long time to reconstruct. And some of it never quite comes back the same shape. Dale Pruett's fate was decided over the following 3 weeks. The internal affairs investigation was thorough and methodical, and ultimately arrived at a conclusion that satisfied no one entirely, which is usually the sign that it was accurate. Dale had not been a conspirator. He had not knowingly interfered with federal operations. He had been manipulated, expertly, patiently, by people who understood his psychology and his professional patterns and his appetite for acting on conviction without enough caution. But he had also damaged federal property, conducted a search without proper documentation of probable cause, applied obstruction charges to a man who had asked one legal question and said 14 words before being cuffed. Or his body cam footage made all of this visible and sequential and clear. His badge was pulled, his pension was reviewed, he was not prosecuted, but the misconduct findings went into his permanent record, the kind of record that follows a man into every room for the rest of his professional life. Kevin heard about the final IA ruling from Wills, delivered simply and without commentary. He sat with it for a day before he decided how he felt about it, and the feeling he landed on was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated, the recognition that consequences and justice were not always the same thing, and that Dale's story was a tragedy in the old sense of the word, where a man's genuine flaws are made catastrophic by forces larger than himself. He hadn't been evil, he'd been arrogant and careless. And certain in exactly the way that made him useful to people who needed someone certain and careless, pointed in a specific direction. That was its own kind of failure. It had cost a great deal. Kevin thought about the broken mirror housing in the tree line, the clean rectangles in the warehouse dust. 8 months of Marcus Ellison's life. He didn't feel sorry for Dale, but he didn't feel righteous about him either. He just held the whole complicated weight of it and did his job. The footage from the highway shoulder appeared online on a Thursday, 8 days after the arrest, posted by one of the bystanders who had been at the gas station that afternoon and had recorded the whole thing on a phone held slightly too low. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. You could see the car. You could see the man on his knees in the gravel. You could see the mirror and the moment it broke, and the crowd watching from the shoulder. It had 3 million views by the following morning. The department issued a statement. The county issued a statement. A national news outlet ran a segment. A local advocacy group held a press event in the station parking lot that drew 70 people on a cold morning and was covered by 2 television cameras and a radio reporter who asked Wills questions he answered carefully and without deflection. Kevin watched all of it from inside the station through the front glass. He didn't go out. It wasn't his moment to be visible. What he'd done in the past week had been done in corridors and parking lots and at a desk at 2 in the morning, and he preferred to keep it that way. See, Marcus had already been gone for 5 days by the time the footage surfaced. Kevin didn't know where. Back into the field probably, or into debriefing, or into whatever the space between operations looked like for someone who had spent 11 years doing what Marcus did. There had been no formal goodbye, no ceremony, no handshake in front of witnesses. That wasn't how it worked. One morning the conference room was active, and the next morning it was quiet, and Marcus was simply no longer in the building. Kevin had been fine with that. He understood that some conclusions happened in the background, without announcement. The work that mattered most rarely came with a ribbon on it. He'd made his peace with that somewhere around the second sleepless night in the station, and the peace had held. The recognition, when it came, he was also quiet. It arrived in the form of a meeting that Sandra requested by email, 3 weeks after Carol's detainment, a week after the network arrests. She asked Kevin to come to the field office in the city, which he did on a Thursday afternoon in his own car, wearing his own clothes, not his uniform. The office was the kind of place that didn't look like anything from the outside. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Sandra was there, and a man Kevin hadn't met before, who was introduced simply by his title, which was significant enough that Kevin noted it and didn't repeat it later. There were no cameras. Nothing was recorded. What was said between the people in the room and belonged to them. What Kevin took away from it was this: his actions over the course of those 36 hours, the flags he'd documented, was the footage he'd reviewed, the compartment he'd identified, the Carol lead he'd surfaced, had contributed materially to the successful conclusion of a federal operation and the arrest of multiple individuals connected to a trafficking network operating across 3 states. This was acknowledged. It would be noted in files that Kevin would never read, but that would exist in systems he would never access. His career record going forward would carry a notation that most people at his level didn't have. He was also told in the same level and unadorned language that he would be contacted again, that the field office had use for people like him, that the work he'd done in that week was the kind of work that didn't stop being relevant. The man with the significant title had looked at Kevin directly when he said it, the way people look at you when they want to make sure the thing they're saying lands without being inflated. Kevin had held the eye contact and nodded, and not made it bigger than it was. He drove home through the city afterward with the windows down, even though it was cold, because he needed the air and the noise. He thought about what came next and found that for the first time in a week, the weight of it felt manageable. Not light, that wasn't the word, but manageable. The last conversation happened on a Friday, in the station parking lot, in the early afternoon. Kevin had just come off a morning shift. He was walking to his car when he heard footsteps behind him, and turned and found Marcus standing 20 feet away, hands in the pockets of a jacket Kevin hadn't seen before, looking like a man who happened to be passing through and had decided to stop. Kevin had no idea how long Marcus had been in the parking lot. He suspected that was deliberate. "You look less tired," Marcus said. "3 nights of actual sleep," Kevin said, "does something for you." Marcus smiled. The first time Kevin had seen that. A real one, brief and complete. Then it settled back into his ordinary expression. "The network," Kevin said. "How much of it held together?" "Enough," Marcus said. "Not everything, but enough." He was quiet for a moment. "The month's lost. That's real. We're rebuilding from a different position than we would have been, but the foundation is there." Kevin nodded. He thought about saying something about what had happened, about the highway, about the cell, or about the 16 hours, and then decided that Marcus had already processed all of it in his own way and didn't need Kevin's version of acknowledgement on top of it. "What's next for you?" Kevin said instead. "That question doesn't really apply to me," Marcus said. "Right," Kevin said. They stood in the parking lot for a moment in the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something significant together and have run out of the need to comment on it. The highway was audible in the distance, the low, constant sound of traffic moving through the trees, indifferent and continuous. "You didn't start this," Marcus said then. His voice was level and direct, the same way everything he said was level and direct. "What happened on that road, you didn't start it, and it wasn't yours to stop. But when you had the choice about how to respond to it, you chose right, consistently, from the first moment to the last." Kevin looked at the asphalt between them. "That's not nothing," Marcus said. "In fact, where it actually counts, it's just about everything." Kevin looked up. Marcus was watching him with the same comprehensive, quiet attention he gave the world, the attention of a man who had learned to read things accurately and had a long time ago stopped pretending otherwise. "Take care of yourself," Marcus said. "You too," Kevin said. Marcus gave him one nod. Then he turned and walked toward the parking lot exit, and Kevin watched him go, unhurried, at his own pace, carrying nothing that wasn't already his. He turned the corner past the fence line and was gone. Kevin stood in the parking lot for a moment after that. The sun was low and sharp over the tree line, the kind of afternoon light that made everything look briefly significant. He turned his face toward it for a second, just a second, before he got into his car. He drove back out to the highway. He didn't have a reason to, not a practical one. He just drove north along the familiar stretch, past the gas station with its yellow sign, past the turnoff for the warehouse district, until he reached the section of highway where the shoulder widened between the trees. He pulled over. He turned the engine off and sat in the quiet for a moment. Out the passenger window, the gravel shoulders stretched in the afternoon light. He looked at the spot, really looked at it. The disturbed gravel had settled. The piece of carbon fiber from the mirror housing was gone. Some wind had moved it, or someone had picked it up, or the tree line had simply absorbed it the way the tree line absorbed everything eventually. The road looked like a road again, like a stretch of highway between two exits on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of place that meant nothing unless something happened on it. He sat with that for a long minute. Then, from his left, a car slowed and a cruiser pulled onto the shoulder ahead of him. A county car, one of the newer ones, running its overhead lights in a brief flash of courtesy. The officer who stepped out was young, 25 at most, walking toward Kevin's window with her hand loose at her side and her face professional and open. She bent toward the window. "Everything okay, sir?" she said. Kevin looked at her. He thought about the question and everything it carried. And everything that a version of that same question, asked in the same space, had cost in the past 10 days. "Fine," he said, just stopped for a minute. She looked at him for a moment, reading him the way good officers read people, not with suspicion, but with attention, checking for the things that mattered. "Take your time," she said. She straightened up. She went back to her cruiser and pulled back onto the highway, smooth and unhurried. Kevin watched her go. He stayed on the shoulder for another minute, listening to the highway and the wind in the trees and the ordinary sounds of a road that had gone back to being just a road. Then he started his engine. He pulled out onto the highway and drove. Just as he had learned in the past 10 days, wasn't a single moment. Why, it wasn't a door opening or a pair of handcuffs or a final line delivered in a parking lot. It was the accumulation of smaller choices, which question to ask, which flag to document, when to speak, and when to stay steady. It was choosing right when the easier choice was right there, and nobody would have blamed you for taking it. It was a young officer stopping to check on someone on the shoulder, and doing it with the open, unhurried attention that the job deserved. It was something you kept building, one decision at a time. Kevin drove south toward the station, toward the next shift, toward whatever came next. The highway unspooled ahead of him, long and ordinary and full of moments waiting to be handled well or badly, the same as it had always been and always would be. If the system meant to protect you can be weaponized against you without anyone even knowing. How many people never had someone paying close enough attention? Like and subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they're done.